When they release you, it's not like in the movies. There's no tearful reunion at the front gate, no caseworker who looks you in the eye and tells you that you've got this. There's just a woman in a gray cardigan with a stack of folders on her lap and a phone she keeps glancing at. She hands you a brown envelope, thin as a grocery receipt, containing your birth certificate, your social security card, and a prepaid debit card loaded with $2,500. She says your name, then the words transition complete. She wishes you success, but her voice is already trailing off toward the next form she has to file before the end of the day. That's how it was for me, 18 years. 18 years of caseworkers and curfews, and shared bedrooms and schools where nobody knew your name after spring break. And it all ended in a hallway that smelled of copy paper and disinfectant. I turned 18 on a Monday, and on Tuesday morning I was standing outside the Millhaven Youth Transitional Center with a black duffel bag over one shoulder, and the sky above me the color of old cement. The door behind me gave a small, definitive click, not a slam, just a click, the quietest ending to the loudest 18 years of my life. This story is about what came after that click. It's about being handed nothing and deciding it was enough to start. If you have ever been told you are the problem, if you have ever been shuffled from one place to the next until you started to believe that impermanence was just your nature, then I need you to hear this. And if this story reaches something inside you, hit that subscribe button and come find your people in the comments, because none of us are doing this alone. The morning I walked out, there were exactly two people in the world I could call family. The first was myself. The second was my younger sister, Nadia. Nadia was 14. She had our mother's dark eyes and a stubborn, bright mind that no system had managed to dim. Technically, she was still a ward of the state. Technically, she had 2 more years in the program. But we had made each other a promise years ago in the back bedroom of the Kowalski placement in Deering Street, the one with the water stain on the ceiling shaped like a running dog. We had whispered it to each other like a vow, I will not leave without you. She was standing beside me now, her school backpack on both shoulders, a small duffel at her feet, her chin raised at an angle that dared the whole world to say something about it. She was not supposed to be here, but I had filed the paperwork 3 weeks earlier, citing my legal adult status and our biological relationship, requesting emergency kinship placement. I had sat in the waiting room of the Department of Child and Family Services for 6 hours on a Wednesday. I had filled out 17 pages of forms. I had been told no, then maybe, then we'll see, and then, finally, a grudging yes contingent on stable housing. Stable housing. I looked at my debit card. I looked at Nadia. I looked at the gray sky. We had 72 hours to prove we had somewhere to live. Now what? It was Nadia who asked it, not out loud but with her eyes, those quiet, watchful eyes that had seen everything and forgotten nothing. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out the envelope, not the brown one the caseworker had given me, the other one. The one that had been paperclipped to the inside of my file, the one that Ms. Okafor, the records administrator, had almost thrown away 3 times and had finally, with a sigh of mild bureaucratic guilt, handed to me on my last day. She had said she wasn't even sure it was supposed to be there, that it had come attached to my original intake paperwork years ago, and no one had ever done anything with it. The envelope was old. The paper was the color of a manila folder left in the sun. My name was written on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize, Caleb Mercer. Below my name, a single line, to be opened on your 18th birthday. I had been carrying it around for 3 weeks, not opening it. The way you don't open a thing when you are afraid of what it might not contain. I opened it now. Inside was a letter and a small folded card. The letter was from a woman named Diane Mercer Hollies, a name I had never heard. The card was a business card, old and soft at the corners, for an attorney named Gerald Fisk. Fisk and Associates, Property Law, Dunmore, Pennsylvania. The letter was handwritten, 6 pages, and it began, "Caleb, if you are reading this, then I failed at the one thing I tried hardest not to fail at." I stood on that sidewalk, and I read all 6 pages twice, my fingers going numb in the October wind. Nadia read over my shoulder, close enough that I could hear her breathing slow down the way it did, when she was concentrating hard on something she was trying to understand. Diane Mercer Hollies was my father's older sister. An aunt I had never met, never known existed, because my mother had been estranged from that side of the family and then died before she could bridge the gap. And my father had been absent so long, he had become a rumor. Diane had spent years trying to find us through the foster system. She had been stonewalled, misfiled, and told that contacting the children was not in their best interest. She had tried to get legal guardianship twice and been denied both times due to her housing situation, an old issue she said she had since resolved. And then 11 months ago, Diane had died. Cervical cancer, fast-moving. She had left everything she had to me and Nadia. But everything the letter was careful to explain was not very much. Everything was a property, a house, or more accurately, the ruins of one. A 3-bedroom structure on 1.8 acres in a rural part of Dunmore County that had been in the Mercer family for 4 generations and had sat empty for the last 6 years due to a code violation the county had issued after a partial roof collapse on the north side of the structure. The house, the letter said, was uninhabitable. The land had a tax lien of just over $9,000, and the property had been cited repeatedly for overgrowth and structural deterioration. The attorney, Gerald Fisk, had enclosed a note of his own inside the envelope alongside Diane's letter. It was professional and brief. The note explained that per the terms of the estate, the property title would transfer to me upon my 18th birthday, along with all outstanding debts against it. He recommended, given the scope of the liabilities and the condition of the structure, that I sign the attached quitclaim deed and surrender the property to the county. He had enclosed the quitclaim form already printed, already flagged with sticky arrows showing me where to sign. He wished me well in my future pursuits. I folded the letters and put them back. A knot of something that wasn't quite laughter sat at the base of my throat. This was it, our inheritance. A broken house in a county I'd never visited with a lien I couldn't pay attached to it, and an attorney who had already printed the paperwork for me to give it up. Nadia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Does it have walls?" I said I thought most of them, yeah. She said, "Then it's ours." That's the thing about someone who has spent their whole life in other people's spaces. The bar for belonging is very, very low. The word ours was enough. I tucked the envelope into my bag. "Come on," I said, "let's go see it." The first problem was getting there. We had $210 of cash left, after I'd withdrawn it from the debit card at the ATM, outside the transit center. And a bus schedule that made Dunmore look like a place the world had politely agreed to forget. There was no direct line. There was a bus to Scranton, a second bus to Clearfield, and then a regional route that ran twice a day and stopped within 4 miles of the town of Boreton, which was the nearest named settlement to the Mercer property. From Boreton, the address put us another 2 miles down a county road. We bought the tickets. We ate gas station sandwiches that tasted like cellophane and optimism. We waited on a plastic bench under a ceiling tile that had a slow brown stain spreading from its corner like a thought you're trying not to think. Nadia pulled out a notebook and started making a list. She did this when she was nervous. She made lists, things we had, things we needed, things we could figure out. I watched her write and felt something shift in my chest, something between terror and a stubborn, unreasonable love. She was 14. She had never had a real bedroom that was hers for longer than 14 months. She was making a list about a broken house in a county neither of us had ever seen, and she was not afraid. Or she was afraid and she was making the list anyway, which is the only kind of courage that actually counts. I thought about the last placement. The Gunderson house in the north end of the city. Beige walls and a house rule about not eating after 8, and a family that was not cruel exactly. Just indifferent in the way that people become indifferent when they have done a thing long enough for it to become routine. I had been there for 11 months. Nadia had been placed separately, across the district, in a home that was fine on paper and hollow in practice. We had seen each other twice a month in a supervised visitation room at the family services office, a room with a table and 4 chairs, and a box of crayons in the center like an afterthought. We were not little kids anymore. We didn't use the crayons. We sat across from each other and talked in the careful, abbreviated language of 2 people who had learned not to say everything because saying everything in a supervised room meant having someone write it down and make decisions based on it. We talked about books. We talked about food. We talked in code about whether we were okay, and the code was this: if the other person said fine, they were fine. If they said good, something was wrong but manageable. If they said really good, you needed to find a payphone and call. Neither of us had ever said really good. That was the one mercy of those years. We were never more than bruised, never broken enough to use the distress signal. I had told myself it was enough. I had told myself we would get through, and then I would get us out. But sitting in that waiting room with the ceiling tile and the slow brown stain, 2 bus tickets to a place I'd never been folded in my jacket pocket. I understood for the first time that getting through had been a different thing from living. We had been surviving in pieces, and now, for the first time, we were going to try to survive whole. The bus ride was long. We switched twice. The landscape outside the window went from city to suburb to the long, flat commercial stretches of outer highway, and then, slowly, to something older and quieter. Hills started to appear. The trees got denser. The towns we passed through had names that sounded like they'd been picked out of a hat in 1802, and nobody had revisited the decision since. I watched it all go by and thought about Deanne, this woman I had never met, who had spent years trying to find us through the brick walls of a bureaucracy that was not designed to help people find each other. I thought about what it had cost her. I thought about those 6 handwritten pages and what it must have taken to write them, knowing she might never know if we got them. We arrived in Boreton at 4:30 in the afternoon. The regional bus let us off in front of what appeared to be the town's only commercial enterprise, a combination feed store and postal substation called Hendricks General. There was a hand-lettered sign in the window advertising firewood and a notice about a missing beagle. The smell of dry feed grain and cold air hit us when the bus doors opened. A man in his 60s with a barn coat and a face like a topographic map looked at us from the doorway of the store. "You kids lost?" he asked. His tone wasn't unkind. It was the tone of a man who had seen plenty of things come off that bus and had long since stopped being surprised by any of them. I told him we were looking for the Mercer place. Out on the county road. His face changed, not dramatically, just a small shift around the eyes. He said, "You family?" I said, "Yeah, it's ours now." He studied us for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, as if he had already run the math and decided to believe it. "I'll drive you," he said. "It's too far to walk before dark." His name was Earl Hendricks. He ran the store with his daughter-in-law. He had known the Mercer family for 40 years, he said, because in a county this small you knew everyone for 40 years whether you intended to or not. He had known my great-uncle Raymond, Diane's father. He had known Diane herself, who he described as a hard woman in the best possible sense of the word. He said she had talked about us. that she had kept 2 photographs on the shelf above the register in the general store where she had worked part-time. 2 school photos, him and her, clipped from a community fundraiser packet. He said she had told him more than once that she was going to get those kids back, that it was only a matter of time and paperwork. I stared at the back of his headrest and did not say anything because there was nothing inside me organized enough to become words. Nadia said, "She sounds like she was a good person." Earl said, "She was the stubbornest person I have ever known, and that is not a small statement coming from me." The road to the property was unpaved for the last mile. A 2-track lane with grass growing up the center and maple trees on both sides, whose branches reached toward each other overhead like they were planning something. Earl's truck moved through it slowly, the headlights catching the deep October color of the leaves, amber and rust, and a yellow so bright it looked lit from inside. And then the house appeared. It was standing. That was the first thing I registered. It was standing, which given the attorney's description I had not entirely taken for granted. It was a 2-story farmhouse, white once, the paint now largely surrendered to the elements. The porch ran the full width of the front and sagged badly at the right corner. 2 of the porch columns had separated from the roof line. There were boards across 2 of the downstairs windows. The north side of the structure, which was the part the county had cited, had a section of roof over what appeared to have been an addition, maybe a mudroom or enclosed porch. That had caved inward. Vines had taken advantage. Saplings had pushed up through the foundation on the east side. The yard was chest-high with goldenrod and wild aster, brown and seeded out now in October. Everything bowed over slightly under its own weight, but the chimney was straight. The windows on the second floor were intact. The front door was solid oak and the hinges looked original and still held. Earl cut the engine. He didn't say anything. Nadia got out of the truck. She walked to the edge of the porch steps, which were cracked but not collapsed, and she put her hand on the railing. She looked up at the house the way someone looks at a thing they have been waiting for without knowing they were waiting for it. Then she turned and looked at me. "It's got good bones," she said. I didn't know anything about buildings, but I knew she was right. We thanked Earl. He said he was 2 miles back, and that if we needed anything, or if the situation turned out to be more complicated than we expected, his number was on a card on the store counter, and we were to feel free to use it. He said the Mercer family had been part of this community for a long time, and that as far as he was concerned, we were too, whether we knew it yet or not. He drove away, and the sound of his truck faded into the trees, and then there was just the wind and the goldenrod bending, and the 2 of us standing in front of a house that was ours. The front door was unlocked. The lock was a deadbolt that had been left in the unlatched position, either by Diane or by the county inspector who had last been through. I couldn't know which. The door swung inward with the deep creak of a hinge that had not moved in months. Inside, the light was gray and thin. Dust motes hung in the air. The entry hall opened into a front room on the left and a staircase straight ahead. The walls were plaster, yellowed but intact. The floors were wide plank hardwood under a layer of grit. There was no furniture except for a single wooden chair pushed against the far wall, and a kitchen table in the back room with one leg shimmed with a folded magazine. The kitchen had an old cast iron range that was too heavy to move and probably too old to sell, and a farmhouse sink with a cracked porcelain basin. The window above the sink looked out into a backyard that had gone fully wild, trees pressing up close. A rusted metal structure, half visible in the undergrowth, that looked like it might once have been a chicken coop. I tried the lights. Nothing. Power was cut. I tried the faucet. A sound of distant complaint in the pipes, and then, after a long moment, water. Brown at first, and then, as I let it run, clearing. The water was on. Nadia took off her backpack and set it on the kitchen table. She ran her hand along the edge of the counter, the old painted wood, the metal lip of the sink. She opened a cabinet. Inside, stacked neatly, were 4 mismatched plates, 2 mugs, a cast iron skillet, and a mason jar of dried beans so old the paper label had come half off. "Someone left us dishes," she said. Her voice had a quality in it I couldn't name. Not happiness, exactly. Steadiness, maybe. The sound of someone who has landed somewhere and decided to stay. We spent the first night on the floor. I had a sleeping bag in my duffel that I'd carried through 3 placements, because I'd learned early that you always had your own sleeping situation, and you never relied on anyone else for it. We shared it, Nadia taking the bag and me folding my jacket under my head on the hardwood. The room was cold but not unbearable. The wind moved through the house in ways that suggested gaps in the weather stripping, and possibly a window not fully seated in its frame somewhere upstairs, but the structure held. The roof held. We were inside. I lay awake for a long time, listening to Nadia's breathing even out into sleep, and I thought about the attorney's quitclaim form, still folded in my bag. The one with the arrows pointing to where I should sign, $9,000 in back taxes, a code violation, a structure cited as uninhabitable. And I was 18 years old with $200, a sleeping bag, and a sister who had decided this was home before she had even walked through the door. The practical answer was obvious. The letter from the attorney was clear. Let it go. Take whatever small grace came from surrendering the debt. Start over somewhere else. But the water ran clear, and the chimney was straight. And somewhere in this house there was a woman's whole life's effort aimed at getting us here. I wasn't signing anything. The morning came gray and cold. I was up before Nadia and I walked through every room with the flashlight from my phone. I went slow. I looked at things the way I imagined someone who knew about buildings would look at them, which was really just looking at them the way I looked at everything. Which was carefully, and without assuming anything good or bad until I had more information. The first floor was structurally sound as far as I could tell. The plaster was cracked in places but not crumbling. The floors had given one section near the back door but no visible rot. The kitchen ceiling had a water stain, old and dry, from what appeared to have been a leak that had long since resolved itself. Possibly when the power was cut, and whatever had been causing it had frozen or failed. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms. The 2 at the front of the house were intact, paint peeling, floorboards dusty, windows sealed shut with years of paint but unbroken. The 3rd bedroom, the one over the damaged north addition, had water damage along the floor of the exterior wall and 2 boards that gave significantly underfoot. I didn't push past the threshold on that one. The staircase to the attic was behind a door at the end of the upstairs hall. I almost didn't open it, but something made me. The attic ran the full width of the house. It was a full-standing attic, low-beamed but walkable, with a small circular window at each gable end that let in thin morning light from the east. It smelled of old wood and dried lavender, which struck me as strange until I saw the bunches of it, brown and papery, hanging in small tied clusters from the rafters. Someone had done that. Someone had cared about this space. Against the west wall, beneath the slope of the roof, there was a row of objects covered in moving blankets held down with bungee cords. I recognized the care that went into covering them, the deliberateness. This was not junk abandoned in a hurry. This was things put away by someone who expected to come back. I crouched down and lifted the edge of the first blanket. Furniture, old furniture, a dresser dark walnut with the original hardware, the pulls solid brass and dulled but complete. Beside it a rocking chair, the kind with carved spindles and rockers worn smooth from years of use. A small writing desk, cherry wood, with a drop front and a set of small interior drawers. 3 spindle-back dining chairs. A low sideboard with inlaid details along the top that I didn't know the name for but could see were done by someone's hands and done well. I went slowly down the row, piece after piece, all of it old, all of it intact, all of it moved with intention. At the end of the row, tucked between the last piece of furniture and the east wall, was a flat wooden box, the kind used to store documents or maps. I opened it. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had dried and fragmented at the edges, was a stack of papers, old papers. And beneath the papers, a small velvet pouch, drawstring tied, that clinked softly when I moved it. I took the box downstairs. By the time Nadia woke up, I had the papers laid out on the kitchen table, and I was reading by the light of my phone propped against the mason jar. There were 3 categories of documents in the box. The first was a set of receipts and correspondence, decades old, relating to the purchase and appraisal of furniture. The second was a set of handwritten inventory sheets, done in the same careful handwriting as the letters from Diane, cataloging each piece by name, wood type, approximate date, and provenance. And the third, tucked behind the inventory sheets, was a printout from an online auction database with a handwritten note stapled to it in Diane's hand. The printout was dated 18 months ago. It showed a comparable piece, a Pennsylvania walnut blanket chest from the same period as several of the pieces upstairs, that had sold at a regional estate auction for $11,000. Beside the printout, Diane had written, "Caleb, this is what they don't want you to know about. Don't let anyone tell you this is junk. And don't let anyone in this house until you've talked to someone who knows what they're looking at." Nadia was standing in the doorway. She had her arms folded and her head tilted, and she was reading the note upside down the way she'd always read things when she didn't want to seem like she was reading them. She said, "Is that what I think it is?" I said, "I think there's furniture in the attic that's worth a lot of money." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How much is a lot?" I said, "I don't know yet. I need to find out." She sat down across from me and picked up one of the inventory sheets and read it with the careful focus she brought to everything. Nadia had always been the reader. While I navigated the social geography of group homes, the unwritten rules of who sat where and who you didn't look at, she had buried herself in books, library books mostly. Whatever the placement allowed. She had read everything she could find about everything, without plan or purpose, just the way water moves toward low ground because that's what water does. She read the inventory sheet. Then she looked up and said, "Diane cataloged 15 pieces. If even half of them are what she says they are, we're not just talking about the tax lien, are we?" It wasn't a question. I said, "No, I don't think we are. The attorney, Gerald Fisk and Associates, Dunmore, Pennsylvania, I needed to see him, but I needed to be careful about how." Diane's note had been clear. Don't let anyone in until I'd talked to someone who knew what they were looking at. The attorney had already sent me the quitclaim form. He had already made his recommendation. For all I knew, he had a relationship with someone who would benefit from this property changing hands quickly. I didn't know that. But I also didn't know that I was wrong. What I needed first was an independent assessment. I used my phone. I searched American Furniture, Pennsylvania, Antique Appraisal. I found a name, the Susquehanna Valley Antique Dealers Association, a regional organization based in Harrisburg with a member directory online. I looked through the directory until I found a member who listed American country furniture, pre-industrial, as a specialty area. Her name was Charlotte Vey. She had a shop in a town called Millbrook, 40 minutes from Dunmore. I called the number. It rang 4 times and then a woman answered, businesslike and brisk. I told her I had inherited a property, and that I believed there was antique furniture inside that I needed assessed before making any decisions about the estate. I told her I had an inventory with provenance details and maker's marks. I told her I was 18 and that I was calling from the property right now. There was a pause. Then she said, "How soon can I come?" Charlotte Vey arrived the next morning. She drove a station wagon that was at least 20 years old, and she got out of it wearing a waxed canvas coat and carrying a loop and a small flashlight on a lanyard around her neck. She was maybe 55, with silver hair cut short and reading glasses pushed up on her head, and an expression of contained professional interest that reminded me of how a surgeon might look walking into an operating theater. I showed her upstairs. She didn't say much for the first 15 minutes. She moved through the pieces slowly, lifting the moving blankets and folding them back, crouching to look at the undersides of drawers, running her fingers along joints and dovetails. She used the loop twice. She photographed everything. Then she stood back and crossed her arms and looked at the row of furniture, and she said, quietly, "Where did this come from?" I told her what I knew. The Mercer family, 4 generations in this county. She nodded slowly. She said, "The walnut dresser is Philadelphia, circa 1790. Probably the work of a regional craftsman trained in the city school. The inlay work on the sideboard is consistent with documented pieces from the same period. The desk is earlier, possibly 1760s, and the hardware appears to be original and intact, which is unusual. The rocking chair is later and less valuable, but it's a nice piece." She paused. I said, "What are we talking about in terms of value?" She looked at me for a moment with the direct, assessing look of someone deciding how honest to be. Then she said, "At a reputable regional auction, properly cataloged and marketed, the dresser alone would likely bring between $15,000 and $25,000. The desk and the sideboard together, potentially more. The full collection, if it's presented correctly, is a significant estate. I'm talking about a number with 2 commas in it conservatively." I heard Nadia breathe in. Charlotte looked at both of us. She said, "You haven't told the estate attorney about this yet, have you?" I said, "No." She said, "Good. Not yet." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because in my experience, when a young person who doesn't know the value of what they have calls an attorney, the attorney often knows someone who would be very interested in acquiring it quickly for a fraction of what it's worth. I'm not saying that about this specific attorney. I'm saying that before you walk into that meeting, you should walk in knowing exactly what you're holding." She offered to do a full written appraisal for a fee she named that was fair, based on what I could find when I quietly searched it later on my phone. She said she could have a preliminary report to me within the week. She also said something else at the end, as she was putting her coat back on. She said, "I want to tell you something that is not my professional business, but I'm going to say it anyway because you're 18 years old and you walked into this alone. Whoever put those blankets over that furniture and tied them down with bungee cords did it for you. She knew what it was worth. She wanted you to have time. She gave you time. Don't let anyone rush you out of it." I said I understood. She shook my hand, and then she shook Nadia's hand, and she got into her station wagon, and she drove away down the 2-track lane between the maples. Nadia and I stood on the porch for a minute in the cold. She said, 2 commas. I said, "Yeah." She said, "Like 2 actual commas." I said, "That's what she said." Nadia sat down on the porch steps, which creaked but held, and she put her chin in her hands, and she looked out at the overgrown yard and the October trees, and she said, "Caleb, she left this for us on purpose." I sat down beside her. I said, "I know." She said, "She spent years trying to find us. She couldn't get us out, so she left us the next best thing. She left us a way out." I didn't answer that. I didn't need to. The week that followed was the hardest and the most focused work I had ever done in my life. I slept in the house. I kept Nadia in the house, which the kinship placement approval technically required a verified address to confirm. And I called the county social worker assigned to Nadia's case, and I gave her the address of the property, and I told her that I was in the process of clearing the title, and that we had habitable space. In the front 2 rooms on the upper floor. The social worker, a tired-sounding man named Dennis who had a caseload he mentioned twice in our 5-minute call, said he'd need to do a site visit within 30 days. 30 days. I had 30 days to make this house passable. I had never built anything in my life. I want to be clear about that. I had never owned a tool. I had never hung a door or patched a wall or done anything more structural than changing a light bulb under a landlord's supervision. What I had was the ability to watch someone work and absorb what they were doing and ask questions without pride getting in the way. I had learned early that asking a question cost nothing and knowing the answer was worth everything, and that the only people who were too proud to ask were the people who couldn't afford not to be taught. I was not proud. I had nothing to protect. I asked every question I had. Earl Hendricks, it turned out, knew everyone in the county worth knowing in terms of what I needed. I went to the general store the morning after Charlotte's visit, and I sat across the counter from him, and I told him some of what I'd found, not the full scope of it, just enough. And I asked him who in the area knew how to do basic structural work, and would work in exchange for payment that I could not make immediately, but could commit to in writing once the estate was settled. Earl looked at me for a long moment. He had that way of looking at people where you couldn't tell if he was deciding whether to trust you or deciding whether to help you, and maybe those were the same thing. He said, "How old did you say you are?" I said, 18. He said, "And there's nobody else?" I said, "There's Nadia." He said, "Right." He wrote 2 names on a piece of paper from the register roll. He said one was a retired contractor named Sobieski, who had been fixing up old farmhouses in this county for 30 years, and who owed Earl a favor the size of a barn. He said the other was his own son, who was 24 and worked construction in Scranton during the week, but came home on weekends, and who Earl said had been looking for a project with some meaning to it. Both of them came. Sobieski walked through the damaged North Addition and made a sound in the back of his throat like a man doing arithmetic in his head, and then said it was salvageable, that the damage was limited to the extension and had not compromised the main structure, and that with the right materials and a weekend of work, he could put the roof back and make the section weathertight. He said he didn't want money now. He said he'd take a handshake and a written agreement, and that he believed me when I said I'd pay him when the estate cleared, and that if I didn't he knew where I lived. And he said this last part with the first smile I'd seen him produce. Earl's son was named Marcus. He was quiet and competent, and he showed up Saturday morning with a truck bed full of lumber, weather stripping, and window caulk, and he spent the whole day working without more than a few words, which I found deeply comfortable. He replaced the rotten boards in the back bedroom floor. He reseated the downstairs windows and replaced the broken glass in the kitchen sash. He found the source of the cold draft that had been coming from somewhere behind the kitchen baseboard and sealed it. By the time he left on Sunday evening, the house was a different temperature. Nadia bought cleaning supplies at Hendricks General with $8 of our remaining money, and she cleaned every surface on the first floor. She scrubbed the cast iron sink until the porcelain showed. She swept and mopped the kitchen floor 3 times. She found a broom behind the pantry door that had probably been there for 15 years, and she used it without comment. She found a tin of beeswax polish under the kitchen sink, and she polished the wood of the front room floor on her hands and knees until it started to give off a low, warm glow. We got the electricity turned on the same week. The account was in the property's name, charged to an estate holding that Gerald Fisk had to authorize. I called Fisk. I told him I was in the property and that I needed the utilities transferred to allow for the site visit required by the kinship placement. I did not mention the furniture. I did not mention Charlotte Vey. I gave him no information that was not strictly necessary. He sounded surprised that I was in the property at all. He said he would take care of the electric account, and that he hoped I understood that the tax situation needed to be resolved promptly. I said I understood and thanked him and ended the call. Charlotte's written appraisal arrived by email at the end of the week. I read it on my phone sitting on the porch steps in the dark with the flashlight off, reading by the screen glow. She had appraised 14 pieces. One of the chairs she had initially included had a replacement seat that reduced its value significantly, and she had noted this honestly. The other 13 pieces she appraised at a combined estimated value at auction of between $140,000 and $190,000. With a note that the Philadelphia walnut dresser in particular, given its provenance and the intact hardware, could potentially exceed her high estimate at the right venue. I sat on those steps for a long time. I thought about the man in the gray cardigan with the phone and the folders and the prepaid debit card and the word transition complete. I thought about every room I'd ever tried to make mine for a few months before the paperwork moved me on. I thought about Diane Mercer Hollies, who I would never meet, who had written 6 pages by hand about the children she had tried to find. I thought about being 9 years old in the third placement, the one in the apartment building on Crane Street, and the way the other kids in the building had known somehow that I was a foster kid, not because anyone told them but because kids always know. They read the small signs. The way you hold your bag, the way you don't ask for anything, the way you look at a room to figure out where the exits are before you figure out where the furniture is. I remembered one afternoon when a boy named Marcus from the 4th floor asked me where my room was, and I said I had one, and he said, "But is it yours?" And I didn't have an answer for that. It had not been mine. None of them had been mine. I thought about Nadia at 7 years old, sitting on the floor of the supervised visitation room with her knees pulled up and her chin resting on them, asking me in a voice so quiet I had to lean in to hear her, whether I thought there was a house somewhere that was going to be ours one day, and me saying yes without hesitation. Not because I believed it, but because she needed me to believe it, and that was close enough. I thought about Diane writing 6 pages knowing she might die before we read them, knowing she might have spent years trying and failed anyway, knowing there was every chance the house would be foreclosed before we turned 18, knowing that the whole plan might come apart at any one of 100 points, and we would never know she had tried. She had written the letters anyway. She had covered the furniture anyway. She had put the business card in the envelope, and she had hoped with the whole of what she had left, and I had not known her name 3 weeks ago, and now I could not imagine getting through a single day without being shaped by what she'd done. I went inside and I made a list. The meeting with Gerald Fisk took place 10 days later in his office in a brick building off the main street in Dunmore. He was a man in his late 60s, compact and careful, with wire-rimmed glasses, and the look of someone who had spent 40 years managing other people's problems from a safe distance. He had arranged the chairs with his desk between us the way people arrange furniture when they want to feel like they are in control of what happens in a room. I sat down. Nadia sat beside me. I had asked her to come, and she had put on her school clothes and brushed her hair and sat straight in the chair in a way that made her look older than 14. Fisk said, "I'm glad you came in. The situation with the property, as you may have come to understand, is not straightforward. The tax lien is accruing interest. The code violation remains on record. I've spoken with the county assessor, and there is a mechanism by which you could surrender the property in settlement of the debts and receive a small consideration payment that I was able to negotiate on your behalf." He slid a paper across the desk. $6,000, he said. "It covers the debt and leaves you with something. It is, I believe, the most practical path forward for someone in your position." I looked at the paper, then I looked at him. I said my position. He said, "You're young, you have no income, you have a dependent minor. The property requires substantial investment to be habitable." The practical reality is, I reached into my backpack. I took out the printed copy of Charlotte Vay's appraisal, all 19 pages of it, and I placed it on his desk. I said, "This is the appraisal I had done on the contents of the property." He looked at it. He looked at the front page and the summary page, and then he looked at me, and for the first time his expression shifted out of the careful neutral he had been maintaining. He said, "Where did this?" I said. "The house contains 14 antique pieces, primarily Philadelphia period, appraised at a minimum of $140,000 at auction. The tax lien is $9,000. The cost to restore the property to code is an estimate I also have from a licensed contractor in the county. I can pay the lien from the proceeds of the sale of 2 of the 14 pieces. I can fund the restoration from the proceeds of a third. I am not surrendering the property." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "I wasn't aware there were contents of that nature in the house." I said, "I know." He said, "Your aunt," I said, "knew exactly what she was doing. She just needed to make sure we got there before anyone else did." He took off his glasses and set them on the desk. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. He was quiet for a long time. "I want you to understand," he said finally, "that I was acting in what I believed were your best interests." I said, "I know. And I want you to understand that from here on, I'll need an attorney who acts in my interests with all of the available information." He looked at me. Then he put his glasses back on. He said, "That's a fair position. How would you like to proceed?" I told him. What I told him was this: I wanted the estate handled properly and completely. I wanted the title searched for any additional encumbrances beyond the tax lien. I wanted the code violation formally cleared after the structural work was completed and documented. I wanted the furniture sold through a reputable auction house, with Charlotte Vay as the cataloging consultant. I wanted a full accounting of any fees or costs the estate had incurred under his stewardship, and I wanted to review them before they were deducted from the proceeds. And I wanted a written agreement between his office and me laying out all of those terms before anything else happened. He was quiet while I said all of this. He wrote things down. When I finished, he looked up. He said, "You've thought about this carefully." I said, "I had time." He said, "Where did you learn to think about these things this way?" I said, "Nobody taught me. I just knew that if I walked in here the same way I walked in everywhere else in my life, expecting someone else to set the terms, I'd walk out the same way I'd always walked out, with less than I came in with." He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, "Your aunt would have liked you." I said, "I think I would have liked her too." The auction was held 4 months later in the spring, through a regional estate house in Harrisburg that Charlotte Vay recommended and that Fisk, who had decided that his interests and ours were better aligned than not, facilitated the legal arrangements for. Charlotte cataloged and presented the collection. She was meticulous and fierce, and she had opinions about the order of the lots and the timing of the sale that turned out to be exactly correct. The dresser sold first. It went for $31,000. Nadia grabbed my arm when the hammer came down, and then immediately let go and looked straight ahead as if she had not done it. I want to tell you what it felt like, not the number, the feeling. Because nobody talks about what it actually feels like when something you were told to give up turns out to be worth fighting for. It doesn't feel like victory. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like exhaling. It feels like the breath you have been holding since the day the door clicked shut behind you, finally leaving your body. It feels like the moment you stop bracing for the next blow and start, slowly and carefully, and with every reason in the world to be skeptical about it. Believing that you are going to be all right. Not fine, not good, not really good, all right. Genuinely, foundationally, for the first time in your life, all right. By the end of the day, the collection had brought in $174,000. The tax lien was paid the following morning. The code violation was cleared 2 weeks after Sobieski finished the restoration of the North Addition, which he completed in 3 weekends, and which he did with a thoroughness that suggested he had decided this was a project he cared about. Marcus came back 2 more weekends after that and helped me replace the porch boards and reset the columns and sand and repaint the front face of the house. We used the original white. Dennis, the social worker, came for his site visit in the 4th week. He was a heavy-set man with a soft voice and the careful non-committal expression of someone who had learned not to react visibly to anything, because reacting visibly to things in his job led to complications. He walked through the house slowly. He tested the stair railing. He checked the smoke detector in the hallway. He looked at Nadia's bedroom, which by then had a real bed frame that Earl had sourced from a church rummage sale, and a curtain rod that Marcus had put up, and a shelf that I had built from pine boards and 2 brackets, and that was already fully loaded with library books. He looked at the kitchen, which was clean and had a working range by then, a used electric one we'd found through a listing in the County Advertiser and gotten Marcus to haul in his truck. He stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard, which was still wild but less threatening now that the saplings on the foundation side had been cut back. Then he turned around and he said, "This is yours." I said, "It's ours." He wrote something in his folder. Then he said, not looking up, "It looks like someone took care of it." I said, "Someone did." He approved the placement. He handed me a form that confirmed Nadia's kinship status and closed the supervised contact requirement. He shook my hand at the door and he said, still in that careful voice, that in 20 years of doing this job, the outcomes he remembered were the ones where someone decided not to wait for the system to solve things for them. He said it with his eyes on his folder and his pen capped, and his voice at a volume that suggested he was not entirely sure he was allowed to say it. I said I understood. He walked to his car. He drove away. I stood in the doorway and I breathed the October air and I felt something I didn't have a word for at the time. I have a word for it now. The word is arrived. It's been 3 years since that morning on the sidewalk outside Millhaven. The house is ours. It has been legally, formally, without question ours since the title was cleared, and the lien released and Gerald Fisk filed the final paperwork with a thoroughness that I think was partly professional and partly something like penance. The front bedroom is Nadia's. She chose it because of the window which faces east and gets the morning light. She is 17 now. She is applying to colleges. She wants to study history, which surprises no one who has watched her read her way through every library branch in the county. The attic is mostly empty now, the furniture gone, but I kept 3 things from it. The rocking chair, which Charlotte said was the least valuable piece, sits in the corner of the front room. The mason jar that was in the kitchen cabinet, still holding the old dried beans, sits on the windowsill above the sink. And Diane's inventory sheets, the ones in her careful handwriting, are framed on the wall of the hallway between the 2 upstairs bedrooms, not because of what they're worth, because of what they meant. She didn't know if we would ever find them. She didn't know if the system would hold us so long that by the time we got here it would be too late, the house already foreclosed, the furniture already dispersed, the whole careful plan already undone by the machinery of a world that doesn't wait for children to grow up. But she made the plan anyway. She covered the furniture with moving blankets and tied them down with bungee cords, and she wrote 6 pages by hand, and she put a business card in with them, and she hoped. That's what I want to leave you with, not the number from the auction, not the house or the cleared title or the morning I watched Nadia hang curtains in her room with a staple gun, and a look of pure satisfaction. Those things are real, and I am grateful for every single one of them, but they are not the inheritance. The inheritance is the fact that someone held on long enough to hand us a chance. The inheritance is Nadia on those porch steps, saying it's got good bones before she'd even walked through the door. The inheritance is understanding that, when the system hands you a form with arrows already printed on it showing you where to sign everything away, you are allowed to fold it up and put it back in your bag and go find out what you actually have. So many of us have been handed a story that starts with a door closing, with a caseworker who doesn't look up, with a room that isn't yours for long enough to matter. I know that story. I lived that story, but here is what I know now that I didn't know standing on that sidewalk. The story doesn't end at the door. The story starts there. You are the next chapter, and you don't have to write it alone. If this reached something in you, hit that subscribe button. Come into the comments and tell me about a door that closed on you. Tell me what you found on the other side of it. Tell me about the person who, even from a distance, even without knowing if you'd ever come, left something for you in the attic. I'll read every single one, because your story is not finished. And neither is mine. Thank you for being here.